just like to thank Carol for coming all this way with her husband. Really
good. We've driven up from Portland, which is no mean feat in the fog of yesterday.
So the first thing we're going to do is ask you to just tell us about yourself
and your 60 years of working in gender and forestry studies.
70.
70. Brilliant.
As quickly as you can, and then we'll get into the questions.
Okay. I'm an anthropologist, and I've had a lot of experience also with public health. Most of my time, can you hear me all right back there? Okay. Most of my work has been interdisciplinary. So I've worked with medical people, with agriculture people, engineers, lots of different disciplines before I came to C4. And when I came to C4, of course, it was mostly forestry, but ecologists, and there's quite an interdisciplinary group there as well. From an anthropological point of view, I began my career doing normal ethnography, that is living in villages in the US, in Indonesia, two or three places, and in Oman, the Sultanate of Oman, and in Iran as well. So I've had a kind of a broad geographic background. Much of the work at C4 was in the tropics, and it differed from my previous work in being comparative. So we very often would have sites in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And so I got much more superficial, but broader view of the things I was looking at in that context. I retired in 2009, and since then I've been doing a lot of writing and editing. Is that good?
Perfect. So, I mean, as you highlighted something,
Worked in so many contested landscapes around the world, and you've seen changes, environmental loss, cultural loss, degradation. And does it ever lead you to despair at any point? You seem like a really optimistic person. You seem very hopeful. Do you still maintain that hope? I mean, what gets you up in the morning to do the stuff that you do?
I guess I don't really despair. It is true that everything seems to always be going kind of downhill. But I think the most fundamental reason that I'm okay to get up in the morning is that I have a lot of faith in people's adaptability. You know, I've seen so many different ways of living, and everywhere I go, I see people are resilient. I mean, they sort of adapt to these sometimes terrible things that happen to them. And they change things in their own ways, and that makes me feel optimistic. I do sometimes think, well, here we've all been working at C4 for all these years to protect the forest, and we haven't been very successful. And then, of course, when I think of American politics, it's another reason for despairing. But for some reason, I just have some kind of faith that that we keep coming up with interesting ways of dealing with the world, and I guess I'm just hopeful by nature.
I mean, kind of related to that, you told us today that I've read in many of your tomes that you revisit sites, 20 years, 30 years on, and you see, massive changes. One of the biggest problems I think we find with project cycles is that you work on a 3 to 5 year cycle, and the funding ends 5 years if you're really lucky.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sort of focused on projects rather than process. And your work seems to focus much more on the longitudinal, process type investments, but it's constrained by short project cycles. How do you manage that?
With a lot of frustration. When we started doing one of the projects that I was very involved in is called Adaptive Collaborative Management. And when we started that program, we thought it would take 10 to 15 years to really establish rapport and really get things going in a way that would be sustainable. And we tried to get money, of course, for that amount of time. And the most we got was 4 years. We had several that were 2, and 2 really is not enough. So it's frustrating, and I also feel when you only have those shorter periods that you haven't really been able to give the process a proper chance to succeed. But we did. I think we found as much as we could in that amount of time, and then there's plenty of other things to work on if you can't get what you really want to be working on. And so that's what I guess that's how I've dealt with it. But I have tried to keep hammering home this need for longer funding cycles in all the things I've done. We just did some work on restoration, and that's another one that needs much longer times than it has.
One thing I want to touch upon is, a little bit this afternoon, is positionality. And for example, your Masculinities and Forest book, in chapter 1, you outline very clearly your positionality in a very honest and sometimes, I think, brave way that most researchers would express. Do you think that's something that researchers should express more in terms of exhibiting their or showing their positionality as it relates to their research? Is that something that you would encourage, or is it just something that you personally feel strongly about?
I think it's very important because I guess fundamentally, I think it's important because I don't believe that any of us can ever be totally objective about social phenomena. We are all in a social system ourselves. We're brought up with certain ideas, and and we just, I don't think we can be completely objective. We can try our best, and I certainly do, but I don't think we can succeed fully. And so for that reason, I think it's important to give readers, if you're in something you're writing, or also even in talking sometimes, give them an idea of where you're coming from, what your experience is, and let them make an assessment of how objective you're able to be. And it's true, I know I'm much more open about my background than most people want to be, and I don't say other people have to do it the way I do it, but that's what I felt would let the reader evaluate what I had to say better than not saying all that.
That book actually really highlighted your writing style. You write sort of part memoir, part academic treatise, which is quite a skill. And not many of us have that skill. But your positionality really defines it. It weaves its way through the academic tome as well. So is that something that you've been trained to do, or is it just something that you
No, I think I didn't do that so much until I retired. When I retired, I felt that I was sort of freed. As long as no one was paying me, I could say whatever I wanted. And not that at C4, there was no one trying to tell me what to say. But I felt a sort of, you sort of feel some responsibility to be working on things that they will find interesting. And I wasn't at all sure they would find masculinities interesting. And so at that point, I said, I'm not going to be paid anymore, and then I'll just do what I want to do. And at that point, I began incorporating much more personal information and personal perspectives into the research that I did. And now I'm trying to do this again with another book, and I've gotten into a writing group so that I can be guided by people who are more, are better at writing things that for a lay population. That's what I'm trying to work on now.
And you're currently working on?
It's an attempt to. You really want me to go into that?
Sure.
All right. Okay. For years, I never touched the term colonialism and decolonization, because so much of what was said seemed to me just hyperbole and vague and sort of a rant. But about a year and a half ago, I heard a talk by a guy who was interested in figuring out ways that we could decolonize ourselves and our situation. And he was talking about it in a much broader way, which many people are now. They're not just saying that Europeans did bad things in colonies and everything is because of that, but rather we have inequities at all different scales and in all different parts of the world and in ourselves. And how do we begin to decolonize in that way? How do we begin to notice the things that we're doing that reinforce inequities? And so he came up. The man I'm talking about is Tom Popinski, who's a political scientist, and he came up with these 4 ways that we might look at it. And one of them was narratives, one was institutions, one was ideas, and then the 4th was yourself, your person. It's embodied in you. And that seemed to give me some sort of structure in which to think about decolonization that was not just a rant. It was a way to analyze my own experience. So I've gone through I started when I was 9, and I've gone through to now making cases in the different places, the different contexts in which I've worked. And I've worked in villages, and I've worked at international level, and I've worked everywhere in between. And so I've tried to analyze instances where I felt a decolonizing lens would really improve the situation and make it more equitable. And it's kind of an experiment. I don't know if it will really work or not, but I've come up with 23 cases, and I'm sort of submitting these to my writing group and getting critiques on how to make it more readable. So that's what I'm doing now.
So we characterize this as an evening, Carol, so it's not about me asking questions about. Are there any questions, burning questions from anybody in the audience? Carol at the stage?
I'll start. Go for it, Rob. Carol, thank you again for the first time.
Thank you.
The first words. Very folks that are trying to, and I think we do an okay job, but it's better. So just based on the experience that you had, what works well in the project? What are the main challenges?
Do we need to repeat the question?
Just send it online if you can.
Okay. He's asking what would be ways to improve interdisciplinarity here at UBC, right? Or in general. And yet that's something I've thought a lot about. One of the ways I think is to spend time in the field together, because in that way you begin to understand where the other discipline is coming from, and what are the issues that they're concerned about, and you can begin to, and they begin to understand your field as well. What are the things you have to offer? And that's very helpful. Another thing I think is to kind of establish some ground rules in your interactions, that you do not say, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard of. And that's very tempting for people who have not been, don't have experience with interdisciplinary things, because the assumptions are different in different disciplines. And the assumptions, the practices, the customs, all those things you need to get used to from each other. What else is another good thing that it actually helps? There are training programs that help a group look at the underlying assumptions in their fields, and then discuss those together and come to agreements in whatever project you're starting, that will about how to deal with those differences. Because some of them, like the difference of, like in my field, data can be written, it can be notes. And in a lot of the fields that I've worked with, data are numbers, and that's all there is to it. And so you've got to get past these kinds of miscommunications, which takes communication. Does that help?
Yeah.
Somewhere I put together a list of do's and don'ts, but I can't remember them all right off the top of my head.
Any other questions from the audience?
Thanks, Carol. Nice to compliment what we heard earlier with Nathan at the beginning of the conversation. Kind of on the note of interdisciplinary, stepping outside of kind of formal academic or professional backgrounds. You work with so many different communities around the world. I'm curious if there's, just off the bat, knee-jerk reaction, what's something that you recall as something you learned from a community or a village or people that were so different from where you kind of come from? There's a lot to kind of filter through, but a reaction.
There's one we were just talking about the other day. In Kalimantan, I went hunting with, I had to plead to go hunting with this group because I wanted to see how they behaved, how hunting was done in the forest. And they didn't really want to take me. But I kept begging, and eventually they gave in and took me, and I got to watch what they were doing, and I was very useful. I could hold the lamp, while they messed around with the animals and that sort of thing, but that's about all I could contribute. And so we came back, we stayed for a couple of nights, or I don't know how long, so 2 or 3 nights. And we're coming back just before we get to the village. They pull out all the meat and fish that they have taken, and they set it on the side of the river, and they start dividing it into piles. And as they're dividing it into piles, I'm realizing they're giving a pile to me. So I said, no, you can't give that pile to me. I didn't do anything. I'm just a drain on your energies, And they got mad at me because they said, no, if you come, it's going to be divided equally, no matter who you are. If you're a child, if you're a woman, if you're an old person who can't contribute, you get a share. And that's that. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. And that was a very different way of looking at it. On the same trip, another example was when they were catching a whole bunch of fish. It was, they had a net, and there were all these miles of fish, and I'm getting all excited. I didn't expect so many fish, and so I'm all excited, and they're looking at me kind of disapproving, which was not normal for them. And I said, well, what's the matter? And they said, well, the fish, we used to believe that the fish had a spirit, and that you should be thankful for them to giving themselves to you. And, it's not really quite proper to be so excited about them dying. And then I felt very embarrassed. So things like that happen. It's that kind of thing is what really, you feel you get some insights into how they're looking at the world when that happens. Very exciting. I mean, much more exciting even than the fish.
I've spoken about the anthropologist Colin Turnbull and his work with the Mbuti in Turin, DRC, then Zaire, and then his work with the Eek in Uganda. And he came up with some very subjective critiques, particularly of the Eek. He romanticized, the criticism is he romanticized greatly the Mbuti and had very little distant objectivity, as you referred to earlier, and was referred to the Eek as despicable people. That's a very big judgment call in terms of an anthropologist working with a group for 3 years. How much degree of separation does there need to be in the ethnographic research? You said we can't always be objective. How much do we have to try to be objective in the field of these long-term ethnographic studies?
I think we always have to try to be objective, but I don't think that. I think you can be. I don't think personal relationships with the people well, that's not really right. I think that's a very difficult place, line to draw. As in my life, I've gotten extremely close to my field assistant. So close I had a child with him, and that would be disapproved by many of my colleagues. But I do not regret it because it made me a part of the community in a way that there's no other way I could have been. I really have relatives there. I have been able to keep an ongoing relationship with this community in a way that I could not under any other circumstances. Whether or not I'm objective, I continue to try to be objective, and in that context, while I'm having this affair with this man, I lived with the headman. The headman and this man were at odds. And so I was sort of right between the two because I was the daughter of the one and the lover of the other. And so I sort of reasoned, well, this gives me a little bit of objectivity on these two men's approaches and behavior. It's a very difficult one. The anthropologists have there's a book called Taboo, which writes, each one's a chapter on somebody's misbehavior.
Are you in there?
No, I'm not in the book, but I am in the misbehavior.
I mean, it's a fine line.
Yeah. And the closer you are, the more information you get. But there is some trade-off on your objectivity.
Yes, sorry about that. Francis Seymour in Takamanda, but I'll save that for another time. Hope she's not watching. So the other thing I wanted to touch on was that 20 years ago, you published The Equitable Forest. And there's a great quote from Melissa Leach, defining gender at the time, and if I may. The quote is basically, the debate on gender emerged from the need to move on from an undifferentiated community and thinking about how rural environmental change happens. And importantly, it's about whether and how women's relationship with the environment and its resources is distinct from that of men, and consequently about women's roles and interests in environmental protection. Does that still stand today? We will talk this afternoon a little bit about recognizing male roles in natural resource management as well. And you said largely that the male role has been demonized to an extent and ignored in gender research. So Melissa's sort of definition there that you quote in your book, does that stand, or has gender debate moved on?
I think it's still an important thing to be looking at, because there's so much variability from place to place, and change. It changes over time. So you're never really done with understanding these differences between men and women. But there's a lot more now that we realize we should be looking at. That's kind of mostly sort of from that. I talked this afternoon about a kind of descriptive period that we had to go through in gender studies, because nobody knew what women did. People thought well, from the beginning of my looking at gender, which would have been the 50s a little bit, there was a period until about the 80s where we knew almost nothing about women. We thought they make babies and they take care of the house, and that's all there is, sort of in the West. That was our idea. And that's been, that's not correct. And so I think that was very apropos then, and it's still somewhat apropos now, but of course there's other things that we need to be looking at besides that differentiation.
So one of the critiques of gender studies is that it focuses on one variable, gender, and doesn't necessarily bring into play wealth, class, ethnicity, and other variables.
Yeah.
How much do you agree with that critique?
I think it's a legitimate critique, but I think, it's a sort of, it's a matter of what's the historical trajectory. We needed to do that at first. We needed to focus on women because there was no information. And now we've gradually realized that we need to be looking at things in a much more intersectional way, that is, recognizing different identities and how they interact in a particular person, and how those change the balance of power in people's relations with others in different contexts. And so I think we need to be incorporating those other aspects of identity much more than we have in the past.
So I mentioned earlier that we both worked for the Centre for International Forestry Research, Vogel, and which state headquarters. But one of the things you do in much of your writing, you describe inequities in institutions like C4 in terms of salary allocations, gender relations, institutional inequities that the regional offices would have supported far less than those based in head office. Do you think there's a place for such institutions today? Are they still relevant? Those examples you gave, and that I gave also in that writing, it's not just those institutions, the CGIAR institutions. It's almost all international institutions function that way. And I think so. I wouldn't single out places like C4 as particularly egregious. In fact, C4, I think, tried better than most to overcome them, but they're so institutionalized and so ingrained in the international world that this is one of the things that I'm trying to highlight in this book, is these kinds of things that we just take for granted. We say, oh, well, that's the way it is, and there's nothing we can do about it. But I think if many of us start talking about it and trying to do something about it, it does seem to me that it's a social institution. It can change. Did I answer your question?
I don't know if I heard it right, but did you say that you worked with Sultan of Oman?
Well, I worked in the Sultanate of Oman. I didn't work with the Sultan. No, well, they weren't when I was there. Okay, there's a question about my work in the Sultanate of Oman. And of course, there weren't any trees there. Oh, there was the frankincense, that was it. I was there with my husband, Richard Dudley, who's over there sitting. And I worked with the university there, first in the Department of Health. And we did a lot of community assessments of their teeth, or they had trachoma problems. And so we looked at that. And we would bring all of the medical students into the village and teach them some fairly simple aspect of medical care. And I was working as sort of trying to capture the social elements, but the rest of the people were all medical people. And then I got unhappy with the people in the medical school, mostly the foreigners. And so I switched to agriculture and fisheries. And in that context, I worked with my husband's assistant to look at indigenous knowledge about fisheries in the ocean there. It was an interesting experience. A little bit more difficult to work with Arabs than with people in Indonesia, for instance.
Fishing and like worldview that fish I've sold is so interesting. Do you find that as you now, like you this in a field that has a lot more progressive sort of throughout your time in it, like about like gender and personality, when you're interacting with someone and kind of they maybe are microaggressive or like they have some sort of they say like an insensitivity, like something like that, where it's like a lack of understanding. We usually approach it like quickly in the moment, like a perceptive thing being like, say that, or like that doesn't kind of like checking them in the moment, or do you find that it's better to like kind of spread out your getting them to understand or kind of like bridging the gap like throughout your career as your approach changed or like what do you do?
Are you thinking about interactions with community people or with colleagues?
I'm thinking more colleagues like an academic that are as their work is as focused on the social aspect of forestry.
Okay, the question is, are people, do I quickly react and correct if I see people acting in an insensitive manner, or do I slowly try to change their perspective over time? Is that more or less capture what you were asking?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't correct people. I almost never would correct people because what right do I have to correct other people? But I would try to get the people to understand where I'm coming from. Probably not in that moment, because in that moment it'd be insulting sort of to them for me to correct them. But if I can keep that in my mind, that's something that is a problem, likely to be a problem, and so I can subtly try to move their thinking a little bit closer to mine. I guess that's how I would deal with it.
We have a question online from Gabriela Barragán. How have your perspectives on interdisciplinary work and community collaboration evolved over time? Do you think it would be possible to carry out similar projects today, given the current global challenges and advancements?
Yes, I think we can still do that, but I think it'll be harder to get money, most likely. Although there is a greater understanding of the need for longer term research. I think more people are beginning to realize that some certain kinds of things need a longer term, and there is some money that's longer now that wasn't available at all before. What was the first part of that question?
How have your perspectives on interdisciplinary work and community collaboration evolved over time?
Okay. Let's see. Well, I mean, I don't know if I mentioned that this morning or now. I guess I met with this afternoon. One of the things was that when I first began trying to work collaboratively with people related to forests, I thought that the forest, the formal forest management system was the one that we would focus on, and we would just gradually maybe listen to try to find out what people are doing to see what the effects are. And then over time, I gradually thought, well, I think those people are doing some interesting things, and we ought to be trying to kind of marry this traditional system with the formal system. And then I evolved again, and I thought, so many of the indigenous systems are so much better than the formal systems in many countries, that we should probably be starting with the indigenous system and trying to adapt the formal system to that one. So that's one kind of evolution in my own thinking. I've always had a lot of respect for community peoples. I've always thought that this idea that village people are stupid was a stupid idea, and I don't know where I got that. Oh, my father and mother are both anthropologists. That's probably where I got the idea.
A question, kind of to follow up on the topic of religions and your work on colonizing research. I wanted to ask if you think the work towards decolonizing research and broader type of work needs to be kind of a fundamental shift of how institutions work, or if it's actually more of kind of a personal, a lot of small, like the culmination of a lot of small changes rather than a, if that makes sense.
There was a question whether we're talking about a fundamental shift in institutions, or if we're talking about a little piecemeal sort of bit of personal changes. I don't think there's going to be a fundamental shift. I think there might be a kind of groundswell that would result in a fundamental shift, but I think it would require a lot of personal changes from people like us. Really being sensitized to the behaviors that we take for granted now, and changing our own behavior. I think it's going to be terribly difficult, because the narratives that we hear, that we believe them if there's something, especially something we don't know a lot about ourselves, and the ideas that we are trained in, they come from a sort of colonial background, and so it's extremely difficult. And that's why I'm trying to analyze my own experience so carefully, to see if I can identify things that we in general might be able to pick out, recognize, and change.
What can individual researchers do to decolonize their own research?
What can we do? I think we can analyze our own behavior. We can analyze the institutions in which we're working. We can think about the narratives. Okay, is that really right? I mean, narratives always have some sort of element of correctness to them, or some sort of like a stereotype. But how right is that really? Is what instances does it not fit, and how do we need to change that to make it reflect reality in a more equitable way? So it's that kind of thing. I don't know if that helps, but it's been very interesting to me to think about those things, and probably would for anybody, really. I urge you to.
And so you're talking, I like this topic a lot. So I'm just curious to have those conversations, either with ourselves or with colleagues. What question would we need to ask?
I guess the most fundamental one is, does this particular institution or idea or practice or whatever, does it result in an inequitable situation? And then if it does, how can we change it?
A question from Julia online. She says that my master's thesis was an interview-based study on gender equality Polish forestry. I met with great opposition, often hostility, and outright denial that any gender-related issues exist in forestry. based on your vast experience, what would be your approach to having a productive conversation with foresters who do not believe you need to talk about women in forestry, let alone take action?
That's, that is a hard one. It's interesting to me. I mean, I'm interested to hear that because I have not encountered that kind of hostility mostly from foresters. I encountered it among social scientists when I first started working on gender. There would just be just antagonism. But once I got into fields like agriculture and forestry, people were much more open. I don't know why that was. I think it's partly because they hadn't thought about it before. And what I've encountered is people saying, well, women don't work in the forest, do they? And then you give them a little evidence and they say, oh, you're right. So I don't know exactly. I remember encountering a situation when I was trying to interview the oil palm people industry in Indonesia. And I just encountered a wall, absolute wall, where they would not answer anything I asked. They had a kind of a, what would you call it? They had a story that they had memorized, and they would spout this story out, which had nothing to do with reality. And any question I asked, they just respouted this terrible story. So I'm afraid I can imagine that might have been what she encountered in Poland, but I don't know what to do in that situation. I think it's partly a matter of if you could work on the interdisciplinary aspects and maybe can start to get them to think about, learn about what how they think, and then also share how you think. I think that'd probably be a first step that I would try anyway. Sounds hard though. My sympathies.
Having some email communications with people, but I don't see it on a day-to-day basis. My impression is that people are trying very hard to change, to make it more equitable, but I don't have the impression we've made it very far. What do you think?
You put me on the spot. I think progress has been made.
Progress has been
I
made.
think so.
Yeah, I think some has been made, but we've got a long way to go though.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there's so many disadvantages. The thing one of the things that struck me in looking at my own experience is the importance of the English language. Because so many really, really capable people in developing countries don't speak English well. And so anytime they wind up in an international context, they are severely disadvantaged. And, I don't think of English as such a big deal, but it really is a big deal. And what an advantage it gives people like us in any kind of negotiation or trying to understand something that's being discussed. Being willing to speak. If you're not very fluent, you become shy to speak out. And also, if you speak out badly, then you're likely to be discarded, what's the word, ignored. So I think there's a lot of things, a lot of factors that result in this downplaying of or this lack of representation, I guess, as she phrased it, of people from developing countries.
I was wondering what you see as like scientists' role in policy and in politics. I think because for a long time it's been like taking a stance can lead to like, I don't know, a reduction in efficacy or something. And so I'm wondering what you think, particularly people who are studying things in environment and sociology, like, yeah, what is their role?
She asked, what is the role of people who are, what is the role of researchers, I guess, mainly, in policy, in playing into policy discourse or discussion, right? Well, I just came from, instead of losing my voice, I came from Cornell, where one time I heard a paper that was talking about some wonderful research this woman had done on mining in the village and how the effects of the mine on the community there, and they're really pretty awful effects. And at the end of the talk, I said to her, well, what, have you shared this information with the government? Because maybe they could do something to ameliorate or at least prevent it's getting worse. And she looked at me with this disdain and said, I don't do things like that. So there are people who don't approve. But I think the purpose of research, and there are many purposes of research, but one very important one is to be used and to make the world a better place. And so to me, yes, there are dangers in getting involved in policymaking. You can make a mistake. And you can start to be an advocate instead of a more objective type researcher. But I mean, there's a role for advocates too, you know, so what I've tried to do is be objective and provide information that can be helpful in policy making, in improving policy. And, you know, the things that seem to work to do that it's not so much the things you write as it is the meetings you happen to go to at the exact right moment, you know, in the policymaking process. And so I don't know, the links between research and policy are, you know, fraught with possible failures.
I can remember those endless debates at C4 about negotiating or navigating that fine line between policy and advocacy.
You know,
It was
policy, advocacy, and also extension. We weren't to do advocacy and we weren't to do extension. But if you wanted to actually have I had to fight this battle a lot with adaptive collaborative management because that was seen as just on the edge, you know. We were doing research on how to do it, and that was our argument, and they accepted it, but they kept coming back and asking me again to defend it, you know.
So the question I wanted to ask you about the change in the developing world is the rise of philanthropy. We've got big foundations now driving a lot of development aid and replacing in many respects the traditional CGIAR consortium and others, and playing a role sort of as proto-government sort of policy making, you know, determining health policy, for example, in certain countries. Do you see that as positive or negative development?
Well, we're always short of money, but I find it dangerous. I find it dangerous because it allows one person or in each case that I know of his board to make decisions that seem like they need to be made with a broader group of people. And it puts a great deal of power, you know, money can translate into power and into the hands of people who probably have some great expertise in whatever their field is, or they wouldn't be so successful. But who knows if they have any expertise in the fields that they're providing money to. And so I guess I'd rather, it's sort of the devil we know versus the devil we don't know, I guess, in that question. I think the institutions like the CG need the kinds of reform that decolonization would mean. And we do need money, so there's an argument for taking money from the philanthropists, but it is worrying when it becomes when it's so much money in the hands of so few people.
Any other questions from the audience before we?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could give us an example of one of the times in your life where you said like you could have possibly benefited from like a decolonizing perspective.
Where I could have been.
Yeah, like I don't want you to spoil your book, but I'm just intrigued as to what perhaps like if you had a little revelation from your past.
Let's see. I think the business about the language was one kind of a revelation because I didn't realize until I started analyzing all of this case after case after case that what was going on was the people who speak English dominating, including myself. When I was the program leader for the Adaptive Collaborative Management Program at CFOR. And Ravi Prabhu was also very active and leading Wallenberg. All three of us were extremely fluent in English. And we were working with a team of people from lots of Indonesians who also culturally are quite quiet. They're taught not to talk back to their boss, you know, and so trying to get them to talk was like pulling teeth. But on top of that was Ravi's a very, very talkative man. And I found myself being more talkative than usual maybe. And anyway, I realized that this was sort of a colonialist type situation. Not on purpose, but that's what the effect was. So that would be one example. It's kind of hard to find what you're doing yourself, you know, because you're always, I mean, I'm always trying to do the right thing. And then you sort of realize later what the effect of something you've done was.
Unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you very much. I'm still kind of curious how to let, especially back in Africa, how to let like women understand that feminism is not about living on descent, but it's about how to like improve how to make yourself competitive in an innovative and developing landscape. Because we have issues whereby women usually think that feminism is to go out of the culture, do whatever you like, and without any guidance. So how do you kind of advocate in a way that it's actually letting you understand how to position yourself and aim for an innovative professional career rather than stay on descent and get influenced by others?
The question is, if I can try to paraphrase, how do you teach the women, particularly in Africa, that feminism is not about
Condescension.
on what?
Condescension, like living a wayward life.
Oh, living a wayward life. Oh, okay. But is rather about being innovative in your profession, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I would say, I don't think it's about living a wayward life, but I do think it's about more than just, being innovative in your profession, to my mind. I think it's also about developing some self-confidence it's about being as much as you can be, maybe that means getting educated, or maybe that means being an excellent mother, or maybe that means even being a loving wife. But also maybe it means going overseas for some study. So it's sort of a kind of self-actualization idea. So that's how I see it. And I suppose some of it might result in some people being wayward. Because what is wayward, it depends on your definition. And I think it often does result in some conflict, because maybe with your spouse, because most in many cultures, the husband has the right to guide his wife. But in feminism, the wife would also have a right to guide the husband. It would be more of a give and take, and at least that's the way I see it. And there's many different kinds of feminists. I mean, there are feminists who hate men. There are feminists who only care about the professional advancement. But I have a sort of rounded, I guess, view of it, and more of it's sort of making yourself a fuller human being. I guess that's how I would put it.
Thank you very much for the next presentation. Christmas from Uganda. So based on your work and what you do, I would assume that a lot of women should support what you're doing, or like they're pro what you're doing. Have you ever had like can I say, a scenario when women were like against or not supporting what you're doing, and you got again more support from men instead in your career time?
So is the question is, if, did I have a situation where women didn't approve of what we were doing?
Yeah.
No, we've had a few situations where the men were a little bit wondering what we were doing, but we were always able to explain with the help of the women, the ways that it was beneficial. You know, in each case, the people were choosing something to do that would benefit the community. And so when that was made clear to the men, they always came around and thought that it was a good thing, because it was something that was gonna benefit the whole community in all these cases. So we didn't have any women,
Just to like maybe like rephrase it, so you never had a scenario where a woman or women have tried to be against what you're doing, and you have never got to like, and men instead supported you?
If there was any case where I don't think so.
Okay.
No, I think we usually we would, in Uganda, I think we would usually separate. If there was any question that the women couldn't express themselves, we would separate them into groups and they would discuss what they want to do together. And then later they would bring it together with the men and there would be discussion at that stage. But I think it's always been okay with people. Because we were trying to never force anything. It was trying to be what the local people actually wanted. Because we thought if it wasn't what they wanted, then when we left, they wouldn't continue.
I have a question from Terry's PhD student, Samuel Adianju. He's interested in how do you evaluate the impact of your research beyond looking at the citations of your work and those metrics. In what other ways do you observe the impact of your work?
It's extremely difficult because he's probably asking about adaptive collaborative management, the collaborative work. And that's terribly difficult to really get an assessment that other people will believe. If you're in the field, it's very obvious what's happening. You know, people are learning how to analyze their own situation. They're becoming more self-confident. They're getting networking. They're doing things on the ground, whatever their goals were. So it's easy to assess there. But because in our case, we had 11 different sites on the adaptive collaborative management research, and every place wanted to do different things. So it wasn't as though we could say, okay, and 80% of the places they did X, because there was no agreement from place to place about what they wanted to do. So that's been one of the real sticking points of that approach, because it's so much of the progress is quite qualitative in nature. I mean, you can count things site by site, of course, and we did some of that. Or we saw how much change was there as in relation to how much money we had spent, for instance, and in those original sites, the money didn't make much difference. Really, what made the difference was the motivation of the people who were involved in the work. That made a huge difference. So anyway, it's a problem. There are people working on trying to come up with ways to do that more effectively, but I don't know that they are.
Yeah, I think it goes back to one of the questions about policy and scientists. I mean, Noam Chomsky, as an academic who's spent so much of his life as an activist as well, I don't know exactly what he said, but I remember he said something along the lines of, it's almost accusing researchers and scientists that it's irresponsible to know so much and then not to advocate against kind of the powers that be that create these problems in the first place. And I'm curious, you know, I think as a researcher or scientist, I don't think they all have to be activists in the most obvious of ways. Maybe even if it's just like finding ways to link your insights to the people who do have that voice and courage and bravery in that department. And I think on the broader scheme that the international institutions, the governments, corporations aren't inherently benevolent. There's a lot of benevolent people within them, but then you have civil society, you have solidarity groups and just people's movements. I'm curious if you've ever reflected on how researchers and scientists collaborate with activists, with civil society, with solidarity movements around the world who are looking for a brighter, more equitable future. Is that something you reflected on? And kind of how can we as an academic institution look at that too?
Should I repeat that one?
I think it picked up on the microphone.
Is he close enough?
Mhm.
Yes, we thought about that sort of thing a lot. When we were in that particular program, the Adaptive Collaborative Management Program, some places we worked with the government, some places we worked with NGOs. And we tried to see what would be, how this worked out differently, or you couldn't exactly do a proper comparison, but you could probably pull out some interesting features of the two different ways of working together. As far as you're thinking though more of how we might whether we should work with activists in these NGOs or not, right?
Yeah.
I personally don't have any problem with working with activists. I don't think there's any, I think that activists sometimes get all excited and sort of overstate their point of view. That certainly happens. But I don't see anything wrong with working with them and providing good data to them and trying to make sure that they, I would argue that it's against their long-term goals if they don't represent reality, if they overstate the information they have. But I would go for working with them. What is that? There's a phrase, some kind of action intellectuals. There was a nice paper written by a Nepali guy, and he was arguing that we needed to be action intellectuals, and what he meant was trying to actually make changes in the world through the kinds of advocacy that you're talking about, but founded on good data.
I'm going to find who that was.
You send me an email and I'll send it to you.
Cool.
Heyman Butcha is the first author.
I guess it kind of leads on from that question a little bit, but I was just wondering if you thought there was any room for more direct action that would potentially progress decolonization.
He asked if there's any direct action that might lead to.
If there's any room for it, if you think it's beneficial.
Yeah, I do. I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that might be one of the reasons I'm working on this book is maybe if broader groups understand what needs to be done, then they can move it forward better and in an action sense.
Okay.
And I'm trying to move it forward in an action sense.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on the masculinity question. In your book on masculinities in forests, there's a really neat dedication to men, and it's quite heartfelt. It's like an ode to masculinity in some way. And Debbie, you asked a really nice question around that earlier. Do you want to ask that question again? Because you framed it so well this afternoon. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think my question, it was related a bit to backlash. I mean, it wasn't quite related to the positive role of men, but I guess in general, it is an interesting question to reflect on how to involve men in gender research more broadly. What should the role of men be? And is there a risk of backlash from men if they're not involved in the way that they should be? I think maybe.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
How should we involve men, and is there a danger of backlash if we don't do it right? I think, yes, I do think we should involve men, or we should at least be studying how they look at the world and what are the ideals they have for themselves. Because there's plenty of good things about men. I mean, there's strength and there's intelligence and all kinds of things that they're humans, just like we are. They're actually human. And I don't think, I think there'd be more likely to be backlash if we don't do anything about men. I know that some men, for years we've been focusing on women. And I've certainly picked up from men some irritation about it. Why are you, just looking at women? Why not look at both of us, and acknowledge the good things that some men are doing? And I mean, that you were interested in that, what do you call it? The beginning of the book. And I was, in that one, I was saying, let's recognize those men who are doing these good things, because there's plenty of them out there. The men are not all just doing bad things like violence and whatnot. So I would say there's a bigger chance of backlash if we don't do it than if we do, but.
But I remember I led the Penn analysis of gender differentiation in forest product use, and it was one of the largest data-rich analyses of who uses what, whether you're male or female. And presenting it at various fora, I was challenged regularly. How can you as a man write about gender? It seemed to me somewhat bizarre perspective when it's basically just another researcher looking at an issue of well, it was essentially data, when it just happened to be male and female.
I haven't gotten any blowback for writing about masculinity that I know about. Maybe there's some out there that I haven't heard yet. But I mean, if you're writing about the other genders, then that makes it even more important that you put your own positionality so that it can be assessed accordingly. I've observed things about men, I've listened to men talk, and I'm writing what I got out of that. If a man did an analysis of masculinity, he might very well agree or not agree with what I said,
And it's context dependent as well.
Yeah.
So I think we're running out of time. So Carol, is there anything you'd like to share with us? Just a sort of, you have the last word.
All right.
Inspiring us to do things better in terms of gender studies, ecology, our research, etc.
I have to do that. I was gonna just say thank you for inviting me.
That's also fun.
But I would encourage you to, I would love to see you doing, following up on this kind of stuff, because I think that the world is in trouble right now. And we need to be thinking about the part of the reason it's in trouble, I think, is because of these crazy inequities between countries, between ethnic groups, between religious groups, between men and women, all these different kinds of differences that have such different benefits, such different status, such different treatment. And we should be working to make it a little bit of a more level playing field.
That's perfect, by the way. Thank you very much.
And I'm too old to do it. You have to do it.